Right, greetings, welcome back. So here we are for part 2 of our new religious movements that we've been looking at, and I think it's been quite fun so far. We've just looked at spiritualism. Now we're going to look at box 98, which is what's called Scientology. And there's about 5 million people that follow that at the moment. Estimated possibly up to 80 million in total since it was set up. It's an interesting and somewhat controversial new religious movement. It's called technically the Church of Scientology, so under American law it's got status as a church. It was associated and founded by a chap called Ron L. Hubbard, an American guy, born in Nebraska in 1911. Who was quite precocious. It's another kind of story of genius. He was looking for spiritual truth, deep in understanding, and he travelled, apparently, some say, he travelled to China and places looking for wisdom, and ended up as a student at George Washington University, studying mathematics and engineering, so he was obviously a very clever chap. And studied psychology, but he was frustrated with the way that conventional psychologists work and conventional science. He was a polymath. You see, the problem with conventional universities, it doesn't nurture genius. It pushes you into a mould of already established thought. So if you study psychology, then you study all the great earlier psychologists, starting with Wundt, who founded scientific psychology, and so on, Freud and all the rest of it. And you're not allowed to think for yourself. Whereas Hubbard was someone that wanted to think it out for himself, originally. And he felt that he actually had to leave university to do this. I can relate to that because I did the same when I first went to University of Bristol studying philosophy. I found it so, teaching was so kind of traditional that there was no room for new thought, so I had to leave in order to do my own thinking. But I did go back later, and I can see both. I mean, I love universities, but I also love the freedom outside. Anyway, Scientologists say that Hubbard mastered 29 areas of expertise. They list mathematics, education, art, film directing, horticulture, anthropology, and so on. Well, okay, that should be basic for anyone that's doing something creative and new. I always say to my students, I want them to master all 168 boxes of the table, which includes things like mathematics and chemistry and so on, at least to know the basics of them before they can be literate in religion and philosophy. And so you've got to master, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and these new religious movements before you can even, call yourself a graduate of wisdom. So I think Hubbard was on that level. He wrote in science fiction, because often science fiction is the way to get people thinking new things. We all like science fiction movies and Supergirl and all the rest of it, because they get us thinking out of the box. So Hubbard was one of the founders of science fiction, and he wrote epic novels about time travel in the future and the history of the planet. And then in 1950 he wrote a very famous book called Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health. And this was a new approach to psychology. He came up with the idea that, well, it wasn't originally his idea, but it was, he put it in a new form, that we can get hung up on past experiences, past events. The day somebody said something horrible to you, or the day your parents died, or the day your girlfriend split up with you, or whatever, and you can keep rerunning it in your mind. And you can get trapped in that. And you have to set that free. And so he argued these things are what he calls engrams. and that through Dianetics, which is a branch of scientific psychology and Scientology, you can clear people of these engrams, the pain they're all carrying around with. We're all carrying pain, you know, like, oh, my father died of Alzheimer's when I was 17, which is a fact. Well, I could carry that around with me as a pain source for the rest of my life, you know. But Dianetics gives you the technology and the skill, working with somebody who's a trained person, to clear that. And that's the terminology they use. They say that once you work through the stages of Dianetics, you become clear, meaning you no longer have these engrams. They're no longer imprinted in your soul. And then up in the advanced stages of Scientology, we also carry engrams that we picked up in former lives, because Scientology believes in reincarnation. So, you might have been traumatized in a past life. You might have died in some horrible battle, or been raped or whatever, and you don't know it, but in your unconscious, you're carrying those engrams, and that's why whenever you see, a car with a number plate, XXX, you sort of start shaking, because that reminds you of whatever. So Dianetics also, if applied properly, can clear those past life engrams as well. That's what they say. Now, that's achieved by what they call auditing. So the person that does that with you is the auditor, who then works through this stuff. It's like a counselling thing. And it became very famous and very popular. And the Scientologists created a whole network and organisation for training people in this, which is still going today. Tom Cruise is probably the most famous Scientologist, a great actor. A lot of people in Hollywood were attracted to it because Hubbard lived in California. He then set up he solved the problem of how do you avoid persecution and being called a heretic, because people were trying to call him a heretic, right? Especially the psychiatrists, because they didn't like this, because this is quite a good technique for clearing pain. And that would undercut their pill pushing, because the pharmaceutical drug companies that deal with psychological issues with deadening you with pharmaceutical drugs, that's $1 billion industry. And if Dianetics actually works and can be proved to work, that would really challenge that establishment. So there's been a battle going on ever since between Scientology and the big pharmaceutical official drug companies, who hurl all kinds of abuse at Scientology and say it's a cult and it's dangerous and brainwashing and all that. And the Scientologists who hurl back at the psychiatrists, look, they're crazy people keeping people locked up in padded cells for no reason and just pumping them with drugs and pills so they can make a fortune for the pharmaceutical industry. So, I've studied this in some detail. It's interesting. I think there's some truth in, I tend to gravitate more towards the Scientological approach to healing. If Dianetics can work, then let's use it, let's do it. The problem is, and one of the criticisms held at Hubbard, is that it became a sort of a money spinner. It's very expensive to train as a Scientologist, and it's very expensive to have the auditing. Like, we're talking 10,000 euros just for the first couple of months. I mean, it's about 100 grand in dollars or euros to even begin to get into the secret levels. It's a big business thing, and most people can't afford that. A lot of the people that have mental health problems and are depressed and suicidal, they're the poor, and there's no way they can afford Scientology. I mean, Scientology has become a sort of cult for the rich. You need to be on a salary of 200 or 300 grand a year to even afford the trainings, and that doesn't quite sit with my ethic. I come more from the Robert Owen school of spiritual socialism, and I think truth should be shared instead of hoarded for the rich, by the rich. But that's, that's one criticism. I mean, the thing is, in America, everything's like that. They've kind of made religion into a business. So Scientology is an American business, which has religion as part of its selling attraction. It's religious capitalism, which doesn't sit quite well with my philosophical instincts. And I think that's some of the criticism that's being put at Scientology and some of these other new religious movements. They become a sort of selling thing. Anyway, he solved the problem of how do you escape persecution by going to sea. He created what's called Sea Organization, and he got some big ships, and he went round on the open seas teaching his stuff as his headquarters for a while. Because A, it avoids taxes, and B, they can't arrest you because you're in international waters. So, it's quite a neat move to take a new religious movement to sea, so to speak. He also bought a big property in Sussex, where I grew up in Brighton, called Sant Hill, which is still one of their most important centres in Europe. And it's fascinating. I never went there, but I do know friends who've been there and studied with them, and students and friends of mine have trained as Scientologists. And I also have another connection with them, because in the mid-90s, I set up the first ever mediation service between religions and among religions, called the Multi-Faith and Multicultural Mediation Service. And it's the only one that still exists. I mean, I train people as mediators. Obviously other mediators deal with religious conflict, but nobody specifically. Anyway, I set it up in the 90s. We had a training in Oxford. And then people would contact me with a case, right? I got a phone call from one of the top people in the Scientologists in Britain, or in Europe actually, who contacted me and said, I hear you're running a mediation service for religions. Can I come and tell you what's going on in Germany? So yes, he came along and we had a long chat, and he spent a couple of days with me telling the story. What was going on in Germany in the late 90s was that the German government, which was largely dominated by Roman Catholics and Protestant Christians, had decided Scientology was a dangerous sect. They believed all the false propaganda against them. And therefore they passed a law that you couldn't be a member of any level of German government bureaucracy. You couldn't work as a clerk in a library even, and be a Scientologist, because it was seen as a threat to the state. Right. And this poor old Scientologists, of which there were many thousands in Germany, were like being thrown out on their ear with no jobs. And, they were quite a sort of, they had a business approach to religion, but is that any worse than businesses themselves? I mean, if you've got a secret way to clear people's souls, isn't that worth something? Was their argument. And on what grounds are you persecuting us? Anyway, so that case, I went to Berlin and spoke at a conference on religious freedom that they organised with another English philosopher was with me, and we had some interesting conversations about all this. I do think Scientologists have the right to have their beliefs, and shouldn't be persecuted, and they shouldn't be stopped from employment. But on the other hand, if you don't want to be a Scientologist, you should have that right too. If you want to be a good Catholic or a Protestant or a Marxist or a whatever, choose. If you want to be a spiritualist, go for it. So I believe in freedom of thought and freedom of religion, and on that basis I took on the case. And I corresponded with the German government and the Scientologists, and it went back and forth. And eventually they dropped that legislation. Change of government, they took away the penalties, and now you can be a Scientologist in Germany again, I think. Last time I looked. So my intervention probably helped a bit. And I think that's fair. Okay, so that's the only other thing I want to say that's quite fun about the Scientologists is their teaching on the devil. which is quite interesting. I was researching this when I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Towards a Science of Comparative Diabology, which is an academic subfield of religious studies looking at comparative views of the devil in all different religions. Right? I think it's time we had this conversation. I listened last night to a brilliant lecture by a professor of religious studies in Canada called Professor Mohammed Rostom, great Muslim intellectual, who's one of the team behind the study Quran, which is a parallel project to my commentary on the Quran. And Rostom was pointing out that the devil, Iblis, in Islam, has a slightly different role than in Christianity. He's not like irredeemably evil and torturing people. Rostom was making out some interesting arguments about the devil in Islam, and I was thinking, comparative diabology happening here, you know. Okay, back to Hubbard. You see, he had views on the devil, and now this has come out only because when you get into the higher grades of Scientology, you're told different secrets. And the more you pay, the higher up you go and the more secrets you get. So if you've paid about 100,000 euros, you get a certain middle rank of secrets. Apparently if you've gone up to the 500,000 euros, now you're in the top echelon, you get told the final secrets. One of the final secrets you're told, apparently, and forgive me for revealing this, but I mean it's kind of out there now, is that this Earth is a battleground for good and bad species of beings, extraterrestrials, humans, you know, they're all in this like a long epic Star Wars struggle, even before the Earth was created. And this bit is very like Zoroastrianism, by the way, because they say the same thing. What they say is that there was a particularly nasty kind of semi-fascist ruler type figure, a long, long time ago, millions of years ago, who was leading a breakaway faction from the Creator, from the good God, and was also terrorizing early humans. You know, poor little semi-ape men were roaming about, and this guy was really torturing them and didn't like them at all, you know, cutting open their brains, whatever was being done to them. And then the good guys appeared, like on a giant spaceship or whatever, and rescued the poor little humans from the nasty guy, the nasty evil demon chap, and set mankind free. And those are the ancestors of the Scientologists. They're the rescuing lot, right? Of course. And the nasty guy, the devil chap, they stuck in a magical prison in the Pyrenees, in the south of France, where he is to this day, still in storage, right? Now, when I read this and discovered it, I was researching the Cathars, who were all in the Pyrenees, and who thought the devil was real, and they had a similar story, a backstory. So in my book on comparative diabology, I put the Scientologists' story of the devil, and you know he's alive and well in a cave in the Pyrenees. And I was asking friends down there if anyone had heard this story, or did secret groups of Scientologists come on pilgrimage, and also why hadn't they just killed him? I mean, if he's that evil, why is he being kept in a jail in the Pyrenees rather than just being killed? I mean, surely if he's that devilish, he should be got rid of. So anyway, there's still some questions I've got, because I haven't paid my $500,000 to get access to the secrets. If anyone reading this wants to get in touch with me and tell me, fill me in on the details, I'd be happy, and we can have a discussion, right? But so anyway, and I think it's important, this comparative diabology. I mean, I don't like evil. I don't like, and if there are beings, let's call them devils, that deliberately have done horrible things to humanity, I think they need to be taken care of, and sent a long way away from this planet. It's my view. The really evil forces that may be around. I mean, maybe some really evil forces have taken up residence in the Kremlin and are affecting Putin's mind. I really think they ought to leave the planet. That's my view. And if the Scientologists really are the super squad of divine rescuers, then I think it's time to go into action and get the evil out of the planet. Right, okay, so that's Scientology. It's very exciting. And I love Tom Cruise's films, so I'm definitely, we need more Tom Cruises in the world, saving the world. Now we come to the next one, which is Japanese and Chinese and East Asian new religions. And this is the last one we'll do tonight, box 99. Well, they're, as I said earlier, they're in Japan, it's new religious movements are the thing. Everyone's in one. I mean, yes, you go to the Buddhist temple for your funerals. You go to the Shinto temples for your marriages. But on a kind of weekly basis, you go to your new religious centre down the road for learning the secrets of meditation and stuff. And Scientology is quite big in Japan, by the way. I mean, they've adopted all the Western things, but they have their own. And so there's a tradition called Omoto, which was founded by Deguchi Nao and Ueda Kisaburo, which basically synthesizes the Shinto teachings of Japan, which we looked at a few weeks ago, which are the primal or druid kind of level of teaching. And they then have updated them with Western and scientific knowledge. And so, intellectually it's quite a good thing to be. And and there are quite a few of these traditions that are flourishing. Yes, so Omoto goes back to the 1890s. It flourished in Japan during the 1910s. In 1921, the authorities said it's a threat. Does that sound familiar? And tried to suppress it. But it teaches universal salvation. One of the things that annoys the official Japanese old school government was that Omoto said that, like, the kingdom of God is open to everyone now. It was founded by Deguchi Nao in 1837 to 1918, and his successor Ueda Kisaburo 1871 to 1948. Deguchi Nao was a poor and illiterate widow. So, and she was having these spiritual downloads from a deity called Ushitora no Konjin, commencing in 1892. And she became his prophetess, and she was able to voice prophecies and commands in a majestic voice. She was someone who'd read Buddhism, Shinto, Japanese animism, all the kind of spiritual teachings. Now, was this a deity that was actually possessing her in some way? Or was it just her very active imagination? Scholars still debate this. And in Japan, I mean, millions of people believe it was true and genuine. And it's been flourishing ever since. And it's got an outreach group called the Universal Love and Brotherhood Association, founded in 1925, which campaigns for the abolition of nuclear weapons, organic agriculture, and many other kind of sort of right-on causes, peace causes. I mean, with a name like Universal Love and Brotherhood Association, that's what you'd expect. So, I think I'm sure they did not believe in World War II's Japanese imperial adventures. I'm sure somebody's researched. A lot of the new religious movements in Japan, the founders were penalised or put in prison during World War II, because the Japanese said, no, there's only the one religion, Shintoism, and the emperor's God on earth, and if you don't agree with that, you're a heretic. And we are going to take over the whole Pacific and defeat America. And that was the official line of the Japanese state. So these new religious movements, were persecuted, sadly. but it's a story that we're getting used to, isn't it? There's also other new religious movements in other parts of East Asia. In Vietnam, the tradition called Chao Dai is an example of them. And Chao Dai, a syncretistic Vietnamese religious movement, was founded in 1926 by Ngo Van Chu, who lived from 1878 to 1932. And he was an official of the French colonial administration. He synthesized Eastern and Western thought, because Vietnam at that time was French colonial territory, so they spoke French. He got very interested in spiritualism and attended seances. And at one of these seances, he made contact with a spirit being called Chao Dai, which means high tower, which is a Taoist epithet for the supreme God. And the deity spoke and expressed fundamentals of its worship: universalism, vegetarianism, the image of an eye in a radiant circle. And he came back, did old Chu, to Saigon in 1924 and began teaching what he learned from this god, Chao Dai, the high tower, the supreme god of the Tao. And he initiated some of his friends, a group of 3 people, into this. And so this then became a new religious movement. And here is a photograph. This is a great photograph of the temple of their headquarters. It's very beautiful, the temple, where they practice in Vietnam. They have festivals, daily rituals. It's an aesthetic feast because God, Chao Dai, wants us all to live in beauty. Because if we live with beauty, then our inner moral nature is more beautiful as well. We have near here the great Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who used to live at Plum Village. He's just died, a Zen Vietnamese Buddhist teacher. I'm sure he knew about Chao Dai and probably met them. By 1930, it had 200,000 followers in a population of 8 million. It acknowledges the one God, Chao Dai, but there are intermediaries, and it's nice to see that Joan of Arc is one of the saints of their religion, and so is William Shakespeare, my favourite playwright. So that's how it's eclectic. It's like a new religion, right? So that's an example. Unfortunately, the communists didn't really like it, even though they put Lenin in their list of sacred teachers of the planet, without knowing anything really probably about it and how horrible it was. But the communists shut it down anyway and dispersed the movement. There are about 6 million followers, but most of them have fled from Vietnam. And the headquarters is now in Canada, which is my country of birth, which is, a place of great religious freedom. Thank God. Okay, there are other groups. The Soka Gakkai is an important new Buddhist movement from Japan, which I've known quite a few people connected with it. The word means value-creating society. It was set up in 1930 as a lay Buddhist organisation of the Nichiren Soshu school of Buddhism, founded by Magiguchi Tsunesaburo, 1871 to 1944. And he was arrested during World War II because he wasn't supporting the Japanese imperialist war. And he was put in prison and he died, which is wrong, obviously. But it didn't die out. One of his disciples took it over and it's still flourishing. And that was Toda Josei who took it over. And he died in 1958 and was succeeded by Ikeda Daisaku, who is still going. And he is one of the most revered Buddhist leaders in today's world, I would say. He's a great campaigner for peace, and he was interviewed. He's been going for a long time. He was interviewed in the 1960s by the great historian Toynbee in Britain. I have that, a copy of the book they wrote. And a few years ago, there was an exhibition in Oxford Town Hall in England of photographs and stuff about Daisaku Ikeda's life, Gandhi's life, and Martin Luther King's life. So they have these three modern peace leaders. Each had like a load of panels with stuff about their lives. And it was a lovely exhibition in Oxford Town Hall, which was running for a few months. And I was invited to be on the panel at the launch of the exhibition. I gave a little talk about the three. How would you compare and contrast, and who's the greatest? Ikeda's been doing great work. His organisation is based on what's called the Lotus Sutra, and they chant every day the phrase Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, which is a sacred saying from the Lotus Sutra. And the Lotus Sutra is an amazing scripture. It's a Buddhist scripture, which I've read sometimes in daily prayer practice. And it worships Buddha not as a sort of teacher in a rather remote bit of rural India who had a few hundred followers, but Buddha as a cosmic principle who now lives in the heaven worlds and who is still teaching to millions and millions and millions of bodhisattvas from all world systems. So the Lotus Sutra is like Buddhism on acid. It's like a cosmic display of Buddhist thinking power, in which Dharma, which is what Buddha taught, is the kind of the fuel that powers the entire universe, all the galaxies. So there are Buddhists on every planet in every galaxy, and they all come together to this central place and hear sermons from the guy that visited Earth, Gautama Buddha, but now he's a cosmic Buddha, teaching in the heaven worlds. And if you're really good, you get to go to the part of heaven where he's giving his talks. And that's what these people believe. And they believe that their movement, Soka Gakkai, is a sort of entrance ticket to that part of heaven, which is like the central teaching place of the universe. Not just this planet, but the entire universe. Apparently Tina Turner, the singer, became a member of it. I've known quite a few people who practice this, and they're good people. And if I live long enough, I'm going to do my own commentary on the Lotus Sutra, like I've done on the Quran and the Gospels and so on. There are other traditions. There's Falun Gong in China, which is a new religious movement, initially based around Tai Chi and sport exercises, but it has a cosmology and a mystic sense to it. And unfortunately, it's really been persecuted because it became quite famous in China, and every little village in China was having the Falun Gong sessions. And really all they were doing was like Tai Chi exercises with the sun going up. But before long, they were being persecuted and put in prison and killed off. And the Falun Gong have really been persecuted in the last few decades by the Communist Party, who saw them as a threat. It's like, no, they can't do that because they're getting too many people interested throughout China. So, and I've read some really shocking stories that Chinese communists even went so far as to do things like arrest them and kill them and then harvest their organs. This is what the Falun Gong people say has been done to them. If you really want to frighten a sect, you just kill the people you can catch and then